to start, thank you very much for coming along to this evening's talk. Our speaker tonight needs no introduction, but I will give him one anyway. Matthew Jarron is Curator of the University of Dundee Museums and Secretary of this Society. He is the author-editor of several publications, including Independent and Individualist Art in Dundee, 1867 to 1924, which is available to buy this evening. And he is actively involved in several other organisations locally and nationally, including Lifelong Learning Dundee, University Museums in Scotland, Scotland and Medicine, and the Scottish Society for Art History. So I will pass over to Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wait till you've heard. Put my microphone on so I don't forget. Great, thanks Carly. So I'm going to be looking this evening at the origins and the creation of the memorial up to its unveiling almost exactly 100 years ago on the 16th of May 1925. And my interest really is in the memorial as a piece of public sculpture. As most of you know, I run the Public Art Dundee project, a research catalogue and promotes all of the city's extraordinary collection of public artworks. And the memorial is definitely a strong contender for the largest piece of sculpture in Dundee. So in the 100 years since the memorial was unveiled, it has of course become one of the iconic landmarks in Dundee due to its position on the law. So much so that it's now difficult to imagine the hill without it. And so there's something quite strange about seeing images like these postcards. Thanks to Steve Connolly for sharing these with me. So here we have no war memorial, no TV transmitter, and most obviously no trees. So unlike Balgate Hill, which you can see on the picture on the left there, was already nicely wooded, the law was completely bare, and a far less attractive feature than it later became. This is how the artist Martin Anderson, better known as Cynicus, depicted so-called Bonnie Dundee at the turn of the 20th century. Essentially a rather ugly lump surrounded by smoke-belching chimneys. So having the War Memorial on top of the law made it a destination for the first time, somewhere you'd actually choose to go up to and admire the view. But as we'll see, the law was by no means the obvious location for the memorial, and it remained controversial throughout its development. And as war memorials go, it's a really unusual design. The vast majority of First World War memorials feature soldiers, or angels, or soldiers and angels, crosses, particularly Celtic crosses, and in Scotland we often see cairns as well. But what we have in Dundee is of course very different. This huge beacon with a much simpler, very modern Art Deco inspired design. And it's interesting that each of the four Scottish cities took a very different approach to their memorials. Glasgow's, known as the Cenotaph, was the first to be unveiled in 1924, an open space featuring a large obelisk with a plaque on the ground guarded by lions. Aberdeen unveiled their memorial later in 1925 in the form of the Memorial Hall extension to Aberdeen Art Gallery, creating both an indoor and outdoor space with the figure of an angel indoors and a lion outdoors. And perhaps surprisingly, Edinburgh's took the longest to complete, not until 1927, and was also the smallest and simplest, a sarcophagus placed under the colonnade at the entrance to the city chambers. But of course Edinburgh was also home to the Scottish National War Memorial at Edinburgh Castle, a far more ambitious undertaking that involved the creation of an entire building featuring the work of some 200 Scottish artists and craftsmen led by architect Sir Robert Lorimer, who, as we'll see, also played an important role in the story of Dundee's War Memorial. So like everywhere else across the country, at the end of the war, Dundee was gripped with a veritable fever for memorialisation. Every factory, school, church, Masonic lodge, scout group, an institution of any kind had to have its own memorial paying tribute to those connected to it who had lost their lives in the conflict. These memorials took a huge range of forms. Some were inscribed plaques like the Chamber of Commerce or the Orphan Institution, which is now in the McManus's collection. Illuminated manuscripts like this one in the Masonic Lodge in Blackness Avenue, or the bell ringers at the Old Steeple, which is also now with the McManus. Some involved sculpture, such as the Celtic Cross of the Police War Memorial, or the statue of Christ on the one outside St Joseph's Church. A particular favourite of mine is the Dundee Training College Memorial, designed by James Steedman Hamilton in a gorgeous Art Nouveau style, with enamels by William Armstrong Davidson, both lecturers at Dundee School of Art. It's now in the link entrance to the old medical school here on campus. Stained glass was also popular, and again, here at the university we have a beautiful example in the dental school with this window by Ballantyne and Son from 1918. But amidst all of this small-scale memorialising, the big question was how the city as a whole was to memorialise its dead. These discussions had already begun in the latter years of the war, and during 1917 and 18, the Dundee Advertiser repeatedly discussed proposals to turn the city churches into a war memorial cathedral. Of course, that didn't happen, but a similar approach was taken in Perth, where St John's Kirk was restored, again by Robert Lorimer, and transformed into a war memorial. Dundee officially began to consider its approach on the 4th of January 1919, when a public meeting was held in the Town Hall, chaired by the Lord Provost of the time, William Donn. Now, Donn had been Lord Provost throughout the war, symbolised by this rather splendid portrait of him by the Glasgow boy George Henry, in which we see he's laid aside his civic robes in order to adopt military uniform. The purpose of the meeting was to consider the question of a war memorial to the city's fallen heroes. And the timing of the meeting was significant because the very next day, Donn was heading to Edinburgh for a meeting to discuss the Scottish National War Memorial. So he was obviously keen to get the ball rolling on Dundee's own memorial so as to have something to report on at that national meeting. Well, inevitably at this meeting, there were a wide range of views represented. Several of those present wanted something functional, and the main proposal put forward by the former Lord Provost, Sir James Urquhart, was a children's hospital, which was felt to be badly needed at the time. Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen all had specially equipped children's hospitals, and Dundee Royal Infirmary had started campaigning for one before the war, but had to give up their plans when all fundraising was redirected towards the war effort. Urquhart now saw the chance to reactivate that campaign, but the general opinion at the meeting was that the war memorial would be demeaned by being merely utilitarian. And it would ultimately not be until 2006 that Dundee finally got its own children's hospital at Ninewells. Now, I mentioned that my interest is in the memorial as a piece of public art, and there were 4 people present at that meeting who would have an influence on the physical form that the memorial would take. 2 were architects, Thomas Martin Cappan and the city architect James Thompson. Cappan was also a Black Watch volunteer who had served as local recruiting officer for Dundee during the war. In the meeting, he called for something that would tell the story of the devotion, self-sacrifice and heroism of the men who had fallen. There were also 2 artists at the meeting. Stuart Carmichael, symbolist and Celtic Revival painter and one of the major artistic forces in the city for over half a century, and Thomas Delgatti Dunn, head of Dundee School of Art at the Technical College, which ultimately became Duncan of Jordanson College of Art and Design. Carmichael is quoted as wanting a thing of beauty embodying the virtues, qualities and ideas for which the Black Watch of Dundee had fought. At the end of the meeting, a committee was formed to lead the War Memorial project, chaired by Donn and including all 4 of these men. Well, inevitably, suggestions for the memorial started pouring into the local papers almost immediately. Somebody called J.F. proposed commemorating Colonel Harry Walker, who'd been commanding officer of the 4th Black Watch, but who died from injuries received at the Battle of Luce. The proposal was for an equestrian statue featuring Walker on horseback with 4 of his men on guard around the base to be erected beside the city churches. Meanwhile, someone calling themselves Black Watch was the first to suggest the top of the Law as a location, proposing a large concrete tower to be seen from almost any point in central Scotland. Goodness knows how big it would want to be for that to be possible. His plan was that the tower could be used as an observatory, a meteorological station and a wireless telegraphy station, which is an interesting anticipation of the later TV transmitter erected beside the memorial. Also favouring the building on the lawn was local businessman James S. Kerr, who suggested paths leading up to it in the shape of a thistle, as visualised here in the Advertiser. And one other suggestion for the law was to have a version of the Statue of Liberty on it. Actually looks quite good, I think. Hasten to add, this is not to scale. So the newly established Executive Committee met for the first time on the 10th of March. They quickly agreed to avoid anything utilitarian like a hospital, and they discussed 2 possible sites, one in front of the townhouse, which was Dundee's most prominent civic building at the time, and one to the east of the city churches where a building called Melville House was due to be demolished. No mention was made of the law as a possible site. Thomas Delgatti Dunn wasted no time finding an opportunity to show off a model he had made of an elaborate hexagonal shrine, and an illustration of this next to the city churches was subsequently published in the Advertiser. 2 subcommittees were formed at this meeting, one to deal with the finances and one to consider what form the memorial would take. Again, Carmichael, Dunn, Cappan and Thompson were part of the latter, which first met on the 18th of March. and it was presumably thanks to their influence that an agreement was reached to canvass the opinions of the city's artists and architects, something which interestingly had never occurred during the planning of any previous monuments in Dundee. As a result, meetings were held in March and April with representatives of 3 local bodies, Dundee Institute of Architects, Dundee Art Society and the Dundee branch of the Scottish Art Teachers Association, to agree a joint statement. So this is what they came up with. They concluded that the memorial should not take the form of a building, but would be most suitably expressed in the combined arts of architecture and sculpture, in a form which would record and symbolise the patriotism, heroic deeds and devotion to duty of Dundee's sons who made the supreme sacrifice. They favoured the city church's site and estimated a cost of £60,000, the design to be chosen by competition. All of this was agreed unanimously by the War Memorial Committee, but what they failed to agree was whether to choose the design first and then raise the money, or vice versa. But the Town Council was clear that it wouldn't provide a site without seeing a design. After many delays, the appeal for subscriptions was eventually issued in February 1920. This is the notice that appeared in the papers, in which the Lord Provost states, "The time has now come for an appeal to the citizens of Dundee to raise the funds necessary for the erection of a war memorial worthy of the city." He then goes on to make the claim, no city in the Empire, in proportion to its size, did better in the Great War than Dundee. Now, of course, one might question whether having the largest number of men going to their deaths was a definition of doing better. We might perhaps now think that the opposite would be a better definition. Financially, of course, Dundee probably did do better than most cities because the jute industry always boomed in times of war due to the demand for sandbags, kit bags, tents and so forth. And we might also argue that the anti-war movement was stronger here than other cities, with a substantial number of conscientious objectors leading to the famous description of Dundee as fair hochen wi conscience. However, neither of these claims would have helped the effort to raise money for a war memorial. But even disregarding those inconvenient truths, the fundraising attempts proved a dismal failure. It's worth remembering, of course, that by that time most people in Dundee had already given what they could to the many smaller memorial projects in the city, including the various examples I showed earlier. Plus the fact that shortly beforehand, the Black Watch had launched its appeal for a rest home for former soldiers and their families in Broughty Ferry. That appeal was far more successful, raising £35,000 in less than 6 months, and the building, Dan Alister House, opened in 1921. It survived until 1983, when the building was divided into flats. Anyway, the overall response to the committee's appeal for the memorial was extremely poor, and various complaints were received, including one from the Dundee Association of Dependents of Deceased and Serving Sailors and Soldiers, snappy title, that they had not taken sufficient account of public opinion, specifically that of the mothers and wives of the fallen. By July 1920, there was some discussion within the committee about abandoning the whole scheme, but instead they agreed that only £25,000 should be spent on the memorial, the rest of the money raised to be put into a trust fund to help the dependents of fallen or injured servicemen. Interestingly, one councillor suggested that Winston Churchill should be invited to speak in Dundee to help with fundraising, but recognising how unpopular the MP had become in the city, T.M. Kaplan replied that his appearance would be more likely to raise a riot than raise any money. In the meantime, disagreements continued over the site of the memorial. The city church's site remained a favourite, but 2 new possibilities now emerged. One was thanks to Alexander Spence, who had now taken over from Don as Lord Provost and was thus chairing the committee. He proposed a site in Albert Square in front of what's now the McManus, though that depended on an ornamental fountain being relocated. So you can see it here. Obviously it was later relocated. Spence's idea was for a simple cenotaph with no names inscribed on it, which essentially is what we eventually ended up with, just not in Albert Square. At that time, Stuart Carmichael was opposed to the idea of a cenotaph, claiming that it was a Greek form, whereas he felt the memorial should be of a recognisably Scottish design. The other site came about as a result of James Thompson's plan to demolish the townhouse in order to create City Square, thus raising the possibility of that being a suitable location. Here's one suggestion for using that space, which, as you can see, is very similar to what was then being built in George Square in Glasgow. This, however, prompted a whole separate argument within the committee about the fate of the townhouse. Kaplan was all for getting rid of it, while Carmichael claimed this was nonsense and proposed turning the building itself into a memorial, with a sleeping figure in marble placed in the municipal chamber, and a roll of honour inscribed on revolving stands, and as we'll see, that later idea was eventually taken up. As it turned out, of course, the debate about the townhouse rumbled on for another 10 years before it was eventually demolished to considerable protest in 1932. Meanwhile, the Courier had begun proposing the law as their favourite option. particularly as the council were now in the process of adding a road up to the summit. And courtesy of the City Archives, we now have some lovely photos of said road being built. This is one of several schemes put in place by the council to provide work for the huge number of unemployed men that had returned from the war. About 40 men worked on building this road, all of whom were unskilled, and in the words of the convener of the Works Committee, absolutely useless at the paving of streets. So that's reassuring. So here's the road being built, and you can see some interesting safety features here with these jagged stones being placed along the side of the road. So if you accidentally drove your car over the side and plummeted down the hill, you'd at least have the satisfaction knowing that you'd slashed your tyres on the way. And this is a photo of the completed road, and of course nothing but a few farms on that side of the law, back then. So the road was complete by the end of 1920, and the first car journey up to the top was evidently considered a newsworthy item. So a chap called J. Mingus Bruce drove 4 passengers in a 1921 Rover of 12 horsepower, which is about the equivalent today of a small ride-on lawnmower. And presuming that the 1921 Rover was already available in 1920, and this wasn't a case of him driving round and round the law so fast that he went backwards in time, like the end of Superman the movie. Anyway, you'll see that it says that he made the climb by the new road, though the car had to make a circuit of the hill over a rough footpath before striking the road, which does suggest that they completed the new road but didn't actually think to connect it up to any existing road, which sounds like classic council decision making. Anyway, the reason the road was built up the hill in the first place had nothing to do with the war memorial, but more to do with the fact that the site had been selected for something completely different, namely the Mills Observatory. Way back in 1889, John Mills had bequeathed money to build an observatory for Dundee, but for various reasons nothing had happened, one of the delays being the selection of a suitable site. While many favoured Balga Hill, which of course is where it eventually ended up, in 1915 the Town Council decided to offer a site on the law, though they agreed that nothing would happen until a year after the end of the war. That year having now passed, the construction of a road up the hill was seen as an important first step in finally realising Mills's bequest. But with the Courier and others now campaigning for the law to be used for the memorial, the future of the observatory was once again in doubt. James S. Kerr, he of the Thistle Road design, wrote again to the Advertiser, proposing that the two projects be combined, creating a memorial observatory, as shown here, and various others proposed a similar collaboration. However, all of this was ignored by the War Memorial Committee, who in December 1920 voted to go for the site next to the city churches, now with an even further reduced cost of £15,000. However, in February 1921, James Thompson gave a talk on city planning in which he outlined various schemes that the council had in progress. One of the illustrations that he showed was a proposal for a war memorial on top of the law, and Thompson referred to this as, in his opinion, the only possible site for such a memorial. The image he showed was presumably this one, which was published in the Courier 2 days later, and as you can see, Thompson evidently had something much larger and more traditional in mind. Well, by that time, only £10,000 had been subscribed, but it was decided to go ahead with appointing assessors to judge the competition. On the advice of the Royal Institute of British Architects, the acclaimed architect and designer Robert Lorimer was invited to visit Dundee in April to see the suggested sites. And just in case you're wondering, Lorimer's the one on the right. He quickly dismissed the city church's site as unsuitable, preferring the Albert Square site if both the fountain and the statue of Robert Burns were moved, and we know that Stuart Carmichael was all in favour of the latter, saying personally he wouldn't mind throwing it in the dock. But Thompson, who showed Lorimer around, cunningly made sure that he visited the law as well as the sites that were officially being considered by the committee, and it was the law that Lorimer chose as the best option. In his written report, he described it as a magnificent and unique site for a memorial. A well-engineered road has now been formed leading up to the summit, so that it will doubtless become a place of pilgrimage. Commanding as it does a magnificent panorama of the whole neighbourhood, it would seem a most appropriate place on which to erect some form of Valhalla. The site would be an inspiring one for designers, and it ought to be possible to evolve some comparatively simple form of memorial that would be expressive of its solemn purpose, and at the same time be an effective crown to the law. Well, when the committee next met, as you can imagine, there was considerable debate. Some members, including Delgatti Dunn, insisted on sticking to their previous agreement regarding the city church's site. Others claimed that they'd supported the law site all along, despite the fact that the committee had never officially considered it. Lord Provost Spence claimed that the reason the appeal for subscriptions had been so poor, met with such a poor response, was precisely because the law had not been chosen. By 9 votes to 7, the committee agreed to rescind their previous decision and asked the Town Council for a site on the law. The council agreed to the use of the site, but again raised the question of the observatory, suggesting, and as others had already done, that the £8,000 from the mill bequest could possibly be added to the memorial fund if a combined building could be created. But of course, by doing that, the committee would have negated their previous ruling that the memorial should not take a utilitarian form, and they clearly didn't want to have to reverse a second decision. So they ignored that suggestion, and they also ignored Lorimer's advice that a sum of around £50,000 would be needed to create something on a suitable scale for the site. They agreed to hold a competition to design a memorial for the law to be constructed principally of granite, costing not more than £12,500 plus architects' fees. They still favoured designs which combined sculptural and architectural work, and as you can see from this announcement, they agreed to offer prizes of £250, £150 and £100 for the 3 best designs. Lorimer to be the sole assessor of the competition. Presumably to discourage amateurs, a fee of 2 guineas was charged per entry to be refunded on the receipt of the proposed designs. Well, before the entries even started arriving, there was further complaint in the press. Several demanded that the committee revisit the idea of combining the memorial and the observatory, while one gentleman, calling himself Veteran, suggested relocating the townhouse to the top of the law as a memorial and adding in an observatory for good measure. Very simple, I'm sure. But many more wrote objecting to the law as the chosen location. Somebody called Sapper appeared to speak for many when he asked, how many people in the city, particularly relatives of the dead and ex-servicemen, want the memorial stuck on the top of the law? How many in a generation will see it at close quarters on this site, and how often? Are any of the reasons which demand the erection of a memorial satisfied or met in any degree whatever by its erection on the top of an ugly old mound of metamorphic conglomerate situated over a mile from the centre of the city, where hundreds of old people will never see it? Was any serious attempt ever made to find out the feelings of the community on the question? I think not. Well, the competition attracted 125 entrants, 18 from Dundee, 21 from the rest of Scotland, 85 from England, and even 1 from Canada. 35 had sent models as well as plans, and Lorimer declared that a large proportion were of great excellence. In May 1922, he chose Thomas Braddock of Wimbledon as the winner, with Arthur S. Furner of Golders Green and Messrs Hicks and Charwood of Newcastle as runners-up. Apparently, on hearing this, Lord Provost Spence exclaimed, "Poor old Scotland." You can see Furner's design here alongside Braddock's. It's fairly similar, but with an obelisk form, and apparently Hicks and Charwood's was more traditional, with a figure holding a dove. So this is the winner, 35-year-old Thomas Braddock. He was born in Wimbledon and attended Rutlish Grammar School there, which I discovered was later attended by John Major, Raymond Briggs, the author of The Snowman, and the jazz musician Tubby Hayes. So a very interesting mix there. I'm sure they had fun together at school reunions. Anyway, Braddock went on to study at the Architectural Association schools in London, where he won both the silver and bronze medals, and at the London County Council School of Building. He appears to have begun his career as a decorative designer, and in the 1911 census, his occupation is given as draftsman in decorative metalwork, stained and lead glass and metal windows. However, the following year he won a gold medal from the Royal Institute of British Architects, and that led him to try his luck establishing his own architectural practice in Wimbledon. Dundee's was not his first war memorial. In 1920 he designed this much less ambitious one in Dorking in Surrey. So this is the one surviving architectural elevation created by Braddock as part of his original application, which is now in the city archives, though as you can see it's rather badly damaged, unfortunately. The text of the inscription is still the same as what we eventually ended up with, but as you can see the layout and the font is different. I'm rather intrigued by this bearded figure holding a measuring pole for scale, who seems to be dressed as Rupert the Bear but with a pinion. To assist the entrance, James Thompson had drawn up this plan of the site, showing the area that the monument was to be erected on, with the road curling round it. And by this time the road had been connected up to Kinghorn Road. And as you can see from this close-up, Thompson has added an arrow and written perspective to be from a point in this direction. So presumably one of the drawings that applicants had to submit was a perspective sketch from that viewpoint. And so this is Braddock's sketch from that direction, which again is preserved in the city archives. And I particularly love these windswept figures at the base looking up at it. So an exhibition of the models and plans was staged the week after the announcement of the winner, taking place in the newly opened Cairn Hall and attracting hundreds of visitors. Importantly, this also helped to raise further money towards the total cost, with donation boxes placed in the hall during the exhibition. The Courier was confident that the best design had been chosen. claiming the substantial solidity of the memorial is appealing. There are no unnecessary details, and the presence of the brazier at its summit, where commemorative fires may be lit on anniversary occasions in the future, gives the memorial an additional and satisfying feature. However, despite how impressive it looks here, when Thompson erected a wooden frame on the site to test out the design, there was general agreement that it wasn't substantial enough. In consultation with Braddock, it was agreed to enlarge the base of the memorial and move it slightly further south of the summit, giving a better view from the city centre. So to go back to Thompson's plan of the site, Braddock had envisaged it being right in the middle here, but it actually ended up going down here. But no sooner had Braddock's design been selected than a serious dispute broke out, which threatened to upset the whole project. In June 1922, a rumour began spreading that during the war, Braddock had been a conscientious objector. In the eyes of many, this was tantamount to treason and would clearly make him unsuitable to design a tribute to Dundee's glorious dead. That view was certainly held by Lord Provost Spence, who had chaired the local military tribunals during the war with an unwavering lack of sympathy for conscience. The Courier's London correspondent tracked Braddock down and obtained the full story. Braddock claimed, "I am a member of the Labour Party and for 4 years past have been closely associated with the Labour movement. Like many more, I am against war, and was for years before the late war broke out. Unlike many, I gave public expression to my views. I have defended the conscientious objectors in public, and I maintain that the government bill passed by Parliament making special provision for the COs clearly showed that these men had a case. But I emphatically deny I was a conscientious objector. I registered under the National Registration Act, and at Kingston Barracks was certified as unfit for general service and fit for labour duties only. I did not personally appear before or apply to any military tribunal for exemption, and had I been ordered to join up, I would have done so, however much I dislike war." Braddock produced the relevant papers to prove this, and went on to note the important war work that he'd undertaken as a draftsman. All of this satisfied the War Memorial Committee, but James S. Kerr wrote to the Evening Telegraph complaining about Braddock's wriggling excuses and stating that if everyone had behaved like him, there would be no war memorials to design as we would have lost the war. Arguably, there wouldn't have been a war in the first place. Despite considerable diversity of opinion, the committee unanimously agreed to proceed with Braddock's design, noting how little adverse public opinion there had been about it. The Town Council, however, provided plenty of adverse comment. Bailey Gillis calling it a disgrace to the city of Dundee and comparing it to a pimple on the face of the law. This comment was echoed elsewhere, with many now complaining that the monument was too small, though Stuart Carmichael defended Braddock's design, claiming it was in perfect proportion. One anonymous writer sent this verse into the Courier, which I'm not going to attempt to read out, because I'm pretty sure I can't do it full poetic justice, but I'll leave it for you there to have a read. However, recognising at last that for both practical and legal reasons they couldn't combine the memorial with the Mills Observatory, the council finally approved the design by 10 votes to 6, with 4 abstaining. Interestingly, at this time they still felt that the observatory could be erected on a different part of the law, though, as we know, that idea was eventually abandoned in favour of Balgate Hill. So at last the design was approved and the practical work could now begin. Braddock drew up detailed plans, there's one that's in the City Archives, and William Goldie, of architects Goldie and Hardy, was appointed as measurer. The first crucial decision to be made was where the stone was going to come from. The budget for this was extremely tight. Subscription levels had scarcely improved over the past year, and by July 1922, only 265 people had offered any money at all. J.B. Hay and Company offered to supply Aberdeenshire granite for £11,160, but this was too expensive. Norwegian granite was considered instead, but concerns were raised that some Norwegian quarries were actually German-owned, which was obviously not considered appropriate for a war memorial. Eventually, Cornish granite was settled on, the committee accepting a tender from R. Hert and Son of Montrose to execute the work for £7,950, finally bringing the project costs down to something affordable. Unfortunately, a fresh wave of complaints had now emerged about both the site and the design. In March 1923, the Courier referred to the vigorous campaign of protest which followed the selection of the law as the site, and followed this up in May with an editorial complaining about how unsuitable the site was, conveniently forgetting that it was the Courier that had promoted it in the first place. Referring to Braddock's design, they found it possessing no religious and scarcely any symbolic significance whatever, brutal mass being its chief feature. The Town Council took note, with Councillor William Frayne moving to abandon the law site altogether, claiming the memorial could not be said to represent the desires of the community of Dundee. The Memorial Committee defended their decision. Stuart Carmichael hailed the splendour of the monument and its poetic appearance, while curator and librarian A.H. Miller grandly explained that the erection of a memorial on a hill was in accordance with the experience of a civilised world for 20 centuries and was consistent with a feeling of humanity in general. The next town council meeting set a new standard for intelligent political debate. So I'm going to quote this verbatim, and this is after Frayne had given further lengthy remarks about the unsuitability of the site. Spence, all this is piffle. We've had it over and over again. You should have said that 11 months ago when you granted the site. Frayne, did you say that was piffle? Spence, I did. Frayne, you allow me to say it is not piffle. Spence, you're entitled to your opinion. Well, despite this incisive argument, the council agreed to carry on. Excavation work began in order to lay the foundations, revealing an ancient cup-shaped lamp now on display in McManus, which is believed at the time to be Bronze Age, but is now thought to be Iron Age from the time when there was a hill fort on the top of the Law. Several months and 450 tonnes of cement and metal later, the foundations were complete, and in April 1924, the first shipment of granite, 93 pieces, weighing nearly 90 tonnes, arrived on the SS Moorside. The committee now turned their attention to other details, principally the flare at the top of the memorial. This was originally intended to be fuelled by acetylene, but ultimately the Scarab Oil Burning Company of London was given the contract for an oil burning flare using compressed air driven by electricity. This allowed it to be operated remotely, and with electrical cables now laid up to the top of the Law, also presented the possibility of floodlighting the memorial at night. Another crucial element was the inscription to be carved on the memorial. The proposed wording to the memory of Dundee men who fell in the Great War was questioned, with some feeling that there should also be a monument to those still alive but suffering because of their injuries. After some discussion, it was agreed to stick to the original text. Interestingly, no one seems to have questioned the exclusion of women, though of course several Dundee women were killed during the war, many of them serving as nurses. So for example, Sister Mabel Mill, who was working at number 58 Scottish General Hospital at St Omer when she was killed following an air raid. Civilian women were also killed, such as Alice Smith and her daughter Edna, who were on the SS California when it was torpedoed in 1917. Perhaps as a critical comment for this oversight, in the week that the memorial was opened, the artist Tom Ross exhibited a picture of a war widow on the slopes of the Law behind the memorial, with the memorial behind, to represent women's sacrifice. Sadly, I don't have a picture of that. By summer 1924, the construction was progressing satisfactorily, and it looked as if an unveiling on or close to Remembrance Day might be possible. Earl Haig, who'd been given the freedom of the city in 1919, was invited to do the honours, and he agreed to come on the 22nd of November. By October, however, it became clear that the memorial would not be completed on time. A builder's strike delayed the bronze work on the door, which Braddock had arranged for a company in Cheltenham to undertake. So this was H.H. Martin and Company, a renowned stone carving and metalworking firm, who had also worked on the magnificent memorial to the Black Watch erected in the parish church of St Mary's in 1921, and who would later go on to cast Scott Sutherland's famous Commander Memorial. It was not until March 1925 that the door made by Martins was eventually installed, with a brazier and flare following in April. This also took longer than expected, since a storm delayed the removal of the crane that had installed the brazier for nearly 10 days. The final work then was to complete the road around the memorial. Unfortunately, by the time all this was done, Haig had to leave for a trip to America. So instead, General Sir Ian Hamilton was asked to perform the unveiling. Now this was a controversial choice. Hamilton had commanded the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force in the infamous Gallipoli campaign, described by many as a disaster and by the Evening Telegraph as a glorious failure, which resulted in some 500,000 casualties, including many Dundonians. But Hamilton had not been allowed any involvement in planning the campaign, and many felt that he was later made a scapegoat for its failure. The unveiling was fixed for Saturday the 16th of May, and notices appeared in the press from the 11th of April. Relatives of the deceased were invited to apply for tickets to join the proceedings. Only invited guests were allowed on the top of the Law itself, but employers were encouraged to allow their staff to leave early to attend the event, and were advised to gather lower down the hill on Kinghorn Road and Law Crescent, and on the day many thousands did. Loudspeakers were placed at various points to allow everyone to hear the proceedings, though it doesn't sound like these were particularly successful. The sides of the memorial were covered with Union Jack flags to be released on the day, and I'm assuming that this photo, taken a couple of days before the event, shows some sort of ladder or crane in place to install those flags. 2 special publications were produced to mark the occasion. The official programme, a copy of which can be seen in the City Archives, featured a photograph of the memorial and a description of the decisions taken to arrive at the chosen design and location, which, needless to say, completely ignores all the many controversies and arguments along the way. It also provides information about the accompanying roll of honour, which I'll come back to later. It then sets out the programme for the day with the various speeches, music and wreath laying, which again I'll say more about in a moment. The People's Journal, meanwhile, produced a special supplement, which you can see either in the City Archives or in the local history centre. It featured on its cover not only a picture of the memorial, but also portraits of the 2 most prominent Black Watch officers who'd been killed, Colonel Harry Walker and Captain Edgar Leslie Bowes. Inside was an introduction by the Reverend Harcourt Davidson, minister at St Andrew's Church, who began by placing the event in the context of a long history and prehistory of the law. He wrote, "It would be interesting to know, but it is impossible even to guess, the remote date when the summit of the law was first trodden by a human being. Perhaps it might be just after the last ice age had disappeared from Scotland, long thousands of years ago. Men since then have besieged its summit, have defended it, have worshipped the sun god from it, have washed in its dew, have rolled eggs and fruit on its slopes in the spring. Yes, this old hill has seen many gatherings for war and peace, but we may confidently affirm that never before in its history has it been thronged by so large a concourse of human beings as that which will assemble on its summit this day." This was followed by an essay by Lieutenant Colonel John B. Muir about the gallant history of the 4th Black Watch and the terrible losses it suffered. The full roll of honour was then reproduced with photographs of the deceased where possible. Well, on the day, everything seems to have gone without a hitch. Huge crowds gathered, and here you can see a group of Girl Guides, Boy Scouts and Boys Brigade, with the general public further in the distance behind them. Here's the platform party on the top of the law with the wreaths ready to be laid. This is General Sir Ian Hamilton inspecting the troops. I think this might be the only shot taken by the press on that day that actually still survives as an original print in the D.C. Thomson archive. Hamilton then pressed a button to release the flags, declaring, "To the glory of God and in loving remembrance of the 4,500 heroes of Dundee, I unveil this memorial." This photo was apparently taken just after the flags had come down. A piper then played Lochaber no more, following which Hamilton gave a speech claiming, somewhat depressingly, that the memorial would endure to all time unless those scientists who discovered poison gas should prove their principles to their logical conclusion and explode their own planet. Bit of a downer. The last post and then reveille were sounded, and after various prayers and acknowledgements, the widow of Colonel Harry Walker was invited to lay the first wreath, followed by T.N. Caplan's wife to represent the War Memorial Committee. Further wreaths followed from the Black Watch and numerous other regimental associations, the Boys Brigade and Girl Guides, local schools, and in an interesting early acknowledgement of Dundee's multicultural community, the final wreath was laid by a representative of the city's Italian community. The whole event was broadcast on the radio by the BBC's Dundee studios. Here it is listed in the Radio Times. And apparently this captured not only all the formal speeches and music, but also, according to the Evening Telegraph, a fair selection of the asides and remarks of the folk in the near neighbourhood of the microphone. The event was also captured on film, the edited version of which was shown at the Kinnaird Picture House a few days later. Sadly, that doesn't seem to have survived today. The formal event having concluded, the public were then allowed to visit the memorial, with hundreds queuing up to lay further wreaths. This postcard image was taken later that afternoon. You can see the huge pile of wreaths at the foot of the memorial, and the policeman there holding back the crowds to allow the photographer to take the picture. And at the end of the day, the flare was lit officially for the first time. There was an ongoing discussion about how often this should happen. Stuart Carmichael initially wanted it burning perpetually, but with 5 gallons of oil being consumed every hour, this was clearly unaffordable. In his text for the People's Journal supplement, the Reverend Davidson had suggested that it will mark for us the birthdays of famous men, the days on which our arms triumphed gloriously on sea and land, and the various milestones of our rough island story. Again, far too often. A few months later, complaints were received when the flare was not lit to mark the anniversary of the outbreak of war on the 4th of August. But the committee recommended 2 dates only, Armistice Day and the anniversary of the Battle of Loos on the 25th of September, both of which are still the dates marked by the lighting of the flare today. In August 1926, at Carmichael's suggestion, the committee gave £500 to the Town Council for the ongoing upkeep and lighting of the memorial. The committee's final duty was producing the Roll of Honour. After discussing various options, they returned to Carmichael's suggestion of panels on an octagonal stand with a figure of St Andrew on top, to be placed in the Albert Institute. Local cabinet makers, Methven, Hislop and Company, were awarded the contract, but rumours soon circulated that they were planning to use Austrian oak. This led to a promise being quickly given that only Forfarshire oak would be used. To try to make the roll of honour as accurate as possible, a draft list of names was put on public display for comment and correction. This resulted in at least 160 people being added to it, but of course we now know that the result was still very far from complete, and the Great War Dundee project of a decade ago created a new online version of the Roll of Honour which added many more names, including various women. The oak stand remained in what's now the McManus for many years, but eventually became too dilapidated and was apparently disposed of. But its contents were also reproduced in book form, copies being given to all the branch libraries in Dundee and to the Imperial War Museum. All of this additional work was finally completed in July 1926, the total cost of the whole undertaking being £10,648, 12 shillings and a penny, of which £7,650, 13 shillings and 8 pence have been the construction costs of the memorial. This left just over £2,100 from the subscription fund to be given to help ex-servicemen, relatives and dependents, and a separate trust was set up to distribute that. The much beleaguered committee met for the final time on the 22nd of October 1926, no doubt by that time feeling extremely war-weary. And just as a final short postscript, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the later career of the memorial's designer, Thomas Braddock. So he joined the architectural practice of Andrew Mather in the 1930s. He became particularly successful at designing cinemas. Having worked for Mather on the famous Odeon in Leicester Square, he was then employed by Odeon to design its first Scottish cinemas in Hamilton, Ayr and Motherwell. By that time he was considered such an expert that he actually authored an article about auditorium design in the trade paper, the Kinematograph Weekly. After the Second World War, his most notable work was as senior architect in charge of the redevelopment of Victoria Station in London. But his architectural practice always took second place to his political career. He had co-founded the Wimbledon branch of the Labour Party at the end of the Great War and served as a local councillor for many years. After unsuccessfully standing as the Labour parliamentary candidate for Wimbledon in 3 general elections, he was finally elected MP for Mitcham in the post-war Labour government. Although only in office for 1 term, he continued to serve on the London County Council and contested various seats right up until 1970, when at the age of 83 he was the oldest parliamentary candidate in the country. He died in 1976. So I'll just end with a few more postcard views of the law with the memorial, and again thanks to Steve for sharing these. So this is from Balgay Hill with a track here in the foreground going down to what later became Sagar Street. Here's one from just nearby. You can see the crossroads over here, where City Road meets Tullydef Road with Balgay Parish Church there. And of course the memorial has continued to be a focus for commemorations. This is Remembrance Day in 1931. But it's interesting that all those who said that the memorial should have been outside the city churches did eventually get their way in 1989 with the opening of the Garden of Remembrance there. And of course, just as was argued back in the 1920s, for many that's a much more convenient location for memorial commemorations. But the City Memorial has remained one of Dundee's most iconic and impressive landmarks, and certainly not deserving of Bailey Gillis's dismissive description of it as a pimple in the wall. So I shall end there, and thank you very much.